I never thought knocking on my neighbor's door at 2 a.m. in nothing but a robe would lead to that. But looking back, maybe I should have seen it coming. He was the guy next door, quiet, polite, the kind of neighbor you exchange a few words with in the elevator but never think twice about. We weren't friends, not really. Just two people living on the same floor, existing in the same space, passing each other like ships in the night. But that night, everything changed. It started with something simple. A craving. I was curled up on my couch, legs tucked beneath me, the dim glow of my laptop screen the only light in the room. The city outside was eerily quiet, the kind of stillness that only comes in the dead of night. I took a slow sip of wine, letting the warmth spread through me, but when I reached for the bottle to refill my glass, I realized, shit. I was out. There was another bottle in my kitchen, but the problem? It was sealed. And I, in my infinite wisdom, had somehow managed to live in this apartment for almost a year without ever buying a corkscrew. I should have just let it go. Gone to bed. Drank water like a responsible adult. But I wasn't thinking rationally. Maybe it was the exhaustion, maybe it was the soft hum of loneliness creeping in, or maybe, just maybe, it was something else. A restless kind of energy buzzing under my skin, a heat that had been building all evening without an outlet. And that's how I ended up standing barefoot in the hallway, hesitating in front of my neighbor's door. I had no idea if he'd even be awake, but before I could talk myself out of it, my knuckles rapped against the wood. A pause. Then, the soft sound of footsteps. When the door swung open, I instantly questioned every decision I had ever made. He stood there, blinking sleepily at me, his hair slightly messy, his body, bare except for a pair of low-hanging sweatpants, lean, toned, and completely unfair. The hallway light cast a soft glow over him, highlighting the sharp lines of his collarbone, the ridges of his stomach, the defined curve of his shoulders. I should have said something. Instead, my brain short-circuited for a second too long. He arched an eyebrow, leaning lazily against the doorframe. "Hey," he said, his voice low, scratchy with sleep. "Didn't expect company." I swallowed, suddenly aware of how ridiculous this was. What the hell am I doing? I exhaled, shifting my weight. "I need a favor." That smirk of his deepened, something teasing flickering behind his eyes. "Yeah?" I nodded, gripping the edge of my robe a little tighter. "I need wine. And I don't have a corkscrew." For a moment, he just stared at me, like he was trying to decide if I was serious. Then, he let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "You're knocking on my door," he said, lips curving in amusement, "at 2 a.m, for a corkscrew." I gave a half-smile, shrugging. Desperate times. Another beat of silence. Something hung between us, thick and charged, neither of us acknowledging it. Then, he stepped back, motioning for me to come inside. I hesitated, just for a second. But I knew, the moment I crossed that threshold, that this night wouldn't end the way I'd expected. And I was right. The moment I stepped inside, I felt it. The shift. The air was warmer in his apartment, thick with something unspoken. The scent of him lingered in the space, clean, a little musky, mixed with the faint traces of whatever detergent he used. The kind of scent that made you want to lean in just a little closer, inhale just a little deeper. I told myself this was nothing. Just a simple favor. A neighborly act of kindness. He'd find the corkscrew, I'd take my wine, and that would be it. But as the door clicked shut behind me, sealing me inside with him, I wasn't so sure anymore. His apartment was almost identical to mine in layout, but it felt different. More lived in. Warmer. A soft amber glow from a single lamp cast long shadows against the walls, and I noticed the little things, an open book on the couch, a half-empty glass of water on the kitchen counter, a phone charging near the edge of the table. He stretched, rolling his shoulders slightly, the motion drawing my attention to the defined cut of his arms, the way his abs flexed beneath his skin. He caught me looking, and that damn smirk returned. "You want wine," he said, voice slow, teasing. Or did you just need an excuse to check out my place? I scoffed, crossing my arms. As if. I told you, I'm desperate. He let out a low chuckle and turned toward the kitchen. I exhaled, shifting on my feet. Get it together. But my pulse betrayed me, thrumming a little too fast, my skin prickling with something warm and restless. I wasn't sure if it was the lateness of the hour, the way his sweatpants sat so damn low on his hips, or the fact that I suddenly felt far too aware of my own body, of how my robe hung loosely around me, one strap slipping slightly off my shoulder. I cleared my throat. So, do you always open the door half naked? He glanced over his shoulder, amusement dancing in his dark eyes. Do you always show up at your neighbor's apartment looking like that? My stomach dipped. I should have had a comeback, something sharp and witty, but my brain stuttered. Instead, I watched as he reached up to one of the cabinets, his movements slow, effortless. The stretch of his torso, the smooth ripple of muscle, it was almost unfair. He pulled out the corkscrew, tossing it onto the counter with a soft clink. There you go. Crisis averted. I should have thanked him. Grabbed it and left. But instead, I hesitated. My gaze flickered to the bottle of red sitting beside his sink, already open. A third of it gone. You were drinking? I asked, nodding toward it. He followed my gaze, then shrugged. Had trouble sleeping. I chewed my lip. Same. A beat of silence. Then, he reached for another glass. Held it up in question. I hesitated for only a second before nodding. What harm could one drink do? I padded over to the counter, the cool tiles of the kitchen floor a stark contrast against the warmth of his apartment. He poured, handing me the glass, fingers brushing mine briefly. A small thing. Barely even contact. And yet, my skin tingled where he touched me. I lifted the wine to my lips, taking a slow sip. He watched me, his gaze unreadable. You always drink alone? He asked. I swallowed, setting the glass down. Only when I don't have better company. That smirk returned, slower this time, more deliberate. Something about the way he looked at me then sent heat curling through my stomach, a slow, languid warmth that pulled low, spreading through my limbs. The logical part of my brain told me to leave. But I wasn't feeling particularly logical anymore. I should have left. I should have grabbed the corkscrew, mumbled a quick thanks, and walked out of there like nothing was happening. Like the way he was looking at me wasn't making my skin hum. Like the warmth spreading through my body was just the wine and not something deeper, something heavier, something I had no control over. But I didn't leave. Instead, I took another sip of wine, my fingers curling around the stem of the glass, watching him over the rim as he leaned against the counter, his own drink in hand. So, he said, tilting his head slightly. What's keeping you up at 2 a.m? I huffed a small laugh, swirling the wine in my glass. Oh, you know. Life. My brain refusing to shut up. The usual. He nodded like he understood. Like he knew exactly what I meant. Yeah, he murmured. I get that. The silence stretched between us, but it wasn't awkward. It was charged, humming with an energy I couldn't quite put a name to. His eyes never left mine, dark and unreadable, but there was something in them, something teasing, something slow, like he was waiting for me to make a move. And maybe it was the wine. Maybe it was the way the dim light cast shadows across his jawline, making him look even more devastatingly good than he already did. Or maybe it was just me. Restless. Needing something I hadn't even realized I was craving. I set my glass down, my fingers brushing against the counter as I exhaled. So, what's your excuse? He arched a brow. For what? For being awake, I said, watching him. For drinking alone. His lips quirked at the corner. Didn't feel like sleeping. My pulse kicked up a notch. There was something about the way he said it, low, quiet, like there was more to it. Like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the only one struggling to turn his brain off tonight. Another beat of silence. Then, he shifted, pushing off the counter, stepping just a little closer. I could feel it now. The pull. A slow, unspoken tension winding between us, something thick and heavy settling in the air. My breath caught in my throat. I should have looked away. I should have laughed it off, made a joke, anything to break the moment. But I didn't. Because suddenly, all I could think about was how close he was. How warm the space between us had gotten. How his fingers, long, strong, so damn sure of themselves, rested casually against the counter beside mine, not quite touching, but close enough that the heat of his skin radiated toward me. My robe shifted slightly as I breathed, the fabric slipping just a little lower down my shoulder. His gaze flickered to it. Just for a second. Then, slowly, he lifted his eyes back to mine. The air between us was electric now, buzzing with something sharp and unrelenting. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding. And then, soft, barely a whisper, he said, "You should probably go." I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "Probably," I murmured. But neither of us moved. Neither of us moved. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in, the only thing I could focus on was the heat between us. The slow, unbearable pull. The way his body lingered just close enough to touch, but didn't. It was maddening. I could have walked away. I should have. But my feet stayed planted, my fingers still gripping the edge of the counter like I needed something to hold on to, like the tension between us wasn't making my head spin. His eyes dropped again, just for a second. The robe. The way the fabric had slipped down my shoulder, exposing smooth skin, the slow rise and fall of my breath. Then, his gaze flicked back to mine, and something shifted. Slowly, deliberately, he reached out, brushing his fingers over the fabric, his knuckles barely grazing my collarbone as he adjusted the robe, fixing it back into place. The touch was feather-light. Barely there. And yet, it sent a shiver down my spine. "You really should go," he murmured. My pulse pounded in my ears. "You keep saying that." His lips twitched, that damn smirk threatening to return. "Because it's true." I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. "Then why aren't you opening the door?" He exhaled sharply, shaking his head like he couldn't believe me. Like I was the one making this complicated. But then, instead of answering, he stepped back, running a hand through his already messy hair before grabbing his glass from the counter and taking a slow sip. I watched the way his throat worked as he swallowed, the way his jaw tensed slightly before relaxing again. God. This was stupid. And yet, I wasn't leaving. I didn't want to leave. I leaned against the counter, mirroring him, my fingers tracing the rim of my own glass. "So, what's your deal?" His brow lifted. "My deal? You know." I gestured vaguely at him. "You live next door, you're polite, you nod in the hallway, but you never say much. You keep to yourself." He hummed, swirling the wine in his glass. "Maybe I just like my space." "Or maybe you like keeping people at a distance," I countered. He studied me for a moment, head tilting slightly, like he was trying to figure me out. "And what about you?" I blinked. "What about me?" His smirk deepened, and my stomach twisted in response. "You're here, aren't you?" My breath hitched. Because he wasn't wrong. I was here. Standing in his kitchen in the middle of the night, drinking his wine, lingering in his space, like I belonged there. Like I had wanted this, even when I hadn't realized it. My heart pounded in my chest. I needed to break the moment. To do something, anything, to take the attention off of me before my thoughts spiraled into dangerous territory. So, instead, I grabbed the corkscrew from the counter and held it up. Mission accomplished. He let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. "That's what this was about, huh?" I nodded. Desperate times. His eyes flickered with something unreadable. "Right." A pause. I should have turned. I should have started walking toward the door. But I felt it, that shift, the weight of the moment pressing down on both of us. The slow realization that if I left now, it would be over. Whatever this was. Whatever could have been. And then, before I could stop myself, I said it. One more drink. His head tilted slightly. What? I lifted my glass, offering the smallest smile. One more drink. Then I'll go. His gaze searched mine, like he was weighing the consequences of agreeing to this. Like he knew exactly what he was getting himself into if he let this moment stretch even a second longer. Then, slowly, he exhaled. All right, he said. And he poured. The glass filled, the deep red liquid catching the light for a moment before settling. We clinked glasses, the soft chime ringing through the quiet apartment. I took a slow sip, watching him over the rim. He was watching me, too. And in that moment, we both knew, one more drink wasn't going to be enough. The first sip was slow. Deliberate. I let the wine linger on my tongue, rich and warm, before swallowing. Across from me, he did the same, his dark eyes never leaving mine. I should have been nervous. My pulse was a steady drum in my throat, my body humming with something I couldn't name, but I wasn't scared. I was aware. Aware of the way the dim lighting softened the sharp angles of his face. Aware of the way his lips curved slightly after he drank, like he was savoring something more than just the wine. Aware of the way the silence between us felt anything but empty. I set my glass down carefully, fingers trailing the stem. So, I murmured, do you let all your neighbors drink wine with you at 2 a.m.? He smirked, resting his weight on his elbows against the counter. You're the first. Something about that answer made my stomach twist, heat curling low. I exhaled through my nose, tilting my head slightly. What an honor. You should feel special. I huffed a soft laugh, rolling my eyes. Oh, I do. Another sip. Another moment stretching between us, thick and weighted. His gaze dipped lower again, just briefly, taking in the way my robe still sat loose against my frame, the way my collarbone caught the light, the way my bare legs crossed at the ankles. He didn't say anything, but he didn't have to. I could feel the shift. The tension that had been crackling between us all night had coiled tight, a wire pulled taut, waiting for something to snap. And maybe it was the wine. Maybe it was the fact that I was exhausted but buzzing at the same time. Or maybe it was just him, his presence, the way he carried himself, the way he looked at me like he wasn't sure if he should let this happen, but he sure as hell wasn't stopping it either. I reached for my glass again, but before I could lift it, his fingers brushed mine. Soft. Barely there. But it sent a spark straight through me. I swallowed hard. Careful, he murmured. You'll drop it. I wasn't sure if he was talking about the glass or something else entirely. My breath felt shallow, my heart hammering behind my ribs. I knew what was happening. I knew this was the moment where I could make a choice. Where I could step back, laugh it off, leave. Or I could let this play out. His fingers didn't move from mine. I inhaled slowly, my pulse thrumming beneath my skin. You keep looking at me like that, I whispered, and I might think you want me to stay. His jaw tightened slightly. His grip on the glass shifted just enough to brush his thumb against mine, deliberate this time. Not an accident. I didn't say that, he murmured. But you're not saying the opposite either. Silence. His lips parted slightly, like he was about to say something, but instead, he exhaled sharply and pulled his hand away. A retreat. But not rejection. Not yet. He ran a hand through his hair, then rubbed the back of his neck, as if trying to shake something off. As if he knew damn well that we were standing at the edge of something, and if one of us pushed just a little further, we'd tip right over. I tilted my head, studying him. You always this tense? That got a chuckle out of him. Low. Rough. Only when my neighbor shows up half-dressed in the middle of the night and asks for wine. I smirked. I am wearing clothes. He let his eyes sweep over me again, slow and intentional. Barely. My skin prickled, heat rising beneath my robe. I didn't shy away from his gaze. If anything, I leaned into it, watching the way his throat bobbed as he swallowed, the way his fingers curled slightly against the counter like he was holding himself back. And maybe he was. Maybe this was a bad idea. Maybe he was the kind of guy who never let himself get too close. The kind who kept his distance, because it was safer that way. But I had a feeling, deep, bone deep, that if I pushed just a little more, he wouldn't pull away. He'd snap. And I wasn't sure I wanted to stop it. I picked up my glass again, taking one last slow sip, before setting it down with a soft clink. "All right," I murmured, "I should go." His eyes flickered with something unreadable. "Yeah," he said, voice lower now. "You should." Neither of us moved. Seconds stretched. Then, I turned, slowly, deliberately, heading for the door. I made it exactly 3 steps before his voice stopped me. "Wait." I paused. Heart hammering. And when I turned back, the look in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. I turned back slowly, my pulse a steady drum in my ears. He was still leaning against the counter, but something had changed. The tension that had been simmering between us all night had thickened, stretched so tight it felt like the air itself might snap. His jaw was clenched, his fingers gripping the edge of the counter like he was holding himself back. Like he was still trying to decide whether to let this happen or shut it down before it went any further. But his eyes, dark, heavy-lidded, unreadable, told me he'd already lost that fight. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "You really should go," he said again, but this time, his voice was different. Lower. Rougher. Like he didn't even believe his own words anymore. I tilted my head, stepping just a little closer. "Then tell me to leave." His throat bobbed. His fingers curled tighter against the counter. I waited. But he didn't say a word. Silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, feel the heat of his body even though we weren't touching. Still, he didn't move. Didn't pull away. Didn't stop me. I took another step, closing the distance between us until I was right in front of him. Close enough that I could smell the faint trace of his cologne, the warmth of the wine still lingering on his breath. Close enough that if either of us moved, just an inch, everything would change. My fingers grazed the counter, beside his, barely touching. My breath was slow, measured, even though my body was anything but calm. His gaze flicked down, to my lips, to the curve of my throat, then back up again. I swallowed hard. "This is a bad idea," he murmured, his voice rough, almost strained. "Probably," I agreed. His fingers twitched, like he was resisting the urge to reach for me. I leaned in slightly, just enough to see if he'd move away. He didn't. The air between us was suffocating, electric, every second dragging out like some slow, inevitable collision. I let out a breathy laugh, my lips curling at the corner. "You gonna stand there all night, or?" And then it happened. The snap. 1 second, he was frozen in place, eyes dark and stormy, fighting whatever war was raging inside him. And the next. His fingers curled around my wrist, his grip firm but not rough, his skin burning against mine. I inhaled sharply, startled by the sudden contact. His jaw was tight, his eyes flickering with something dangerous, something restrained. "You're playing with fire," he murmured. A shiver ran down my spine. "Maybe I like the burn." His breath hitched. And then, just like that, his grip loosened, his fingers sliding away from my wrist, his entire body tensing like he was forcing himself to step back, to pull away before this went too far. He clenched his jaw. "Go," he said, voice rough, almost guttural. "Before I forget why I shouldn't touch you." I exhaled shakily, my own restraint hanging by a thread. Every cell in my body screamed at me to stay. To push. To see what would happen if I didn't walk away. But I didn't. Not this time. Instead, I nodded slowly, taking a shaky step back, my heart pounding against my ribs. His eyes stayed locked on mine the entire time. I reached for the door handle, pausing for just a second before turning it. And as I stepped out into the hallway, the cool air hitting my overheated skin, I knew. This wasn't over. Not even close. I stepped into the hallway, the cool air rushing over my skin, but I didn't move. Not yet. The door was still open behind me, just slightly, like neither of us had fully committed to ending whatever the hell that was. My pulse was still hammering. My fingers tingled where he had touched me. My body was still burning, still aching with the tension that had wrapped around us so tightly, I felt like I could barely breathe. I should have walked away. But I didn't. I stood there, frozen in place, my back to his open door, my heart thudding against my ribs. And then, his voice. Low. Rough. Like he was barely holding himself together. Stay. It wasn't loud. It wasn't desperate. It was quiet. Steady. Just one word, but it hit me like a shock to the system. I turned slowly, my fingers tightening on the edge of my robe. He was still in the doorway, his hand braced against the frame, his other curled into a fist at his side like he was fighting something. Like saying it out loud had cost him something. His jaw was tight, his chest rising and falling just a little too fast, and when his eyes met mine, there was no hesitation. No teasing. No smirk. Just heat. Unfiltered. Unapologetic. My breath caught in my throat. I should have asked him why. Should have questioned if this was really what he wanted. But I already knew the answer. And so, instead of speaking, I stepped back inside. His breath hitched. His entire body tensed. I heard the soft click of the door shutting behind me, sealing us in, sealing out the rest of the world. We stood there for a beat, just a fraction of space between us, both of us waiting, teetering on the edge of something inevitable. I swallowed hard. This is still a bad idea. He let out a breathless, humorless chuckle. Yeah. Neither of us moved. The silence stretched. Then, so slowly, he reached for me. Not in a rush. Not in a frenzy. Just deliberate. Intentional. His fingers brushed the tie of my robe, barely touching, not undoing it, just there. Waiting. Giving me a chance to stop him. To pull away. To leave. I didn't. I couldn't. My breath came shallow, my entire body humming like a live wire. And then, his voice. Low. Rough. Barely a whisper. Tell me to stop. I opened my mouth. No words came out. Because I didn't want him to stop. I didn't want to leave. And as I reached up, my fingers skimming over the back of his hand, guiding him, just a little, just enough, his restraint snapped. And so did mine. The moment his restraint broke, so did mine. His hand tightened over mine, his fingers curling around the edge of my robe's tie, but he didn't pull, not yet. He just stood there, breathing hard, watching me, waiting. Waiting for me to stop him. Waiting for me to run. But I didn't. Instead, I reached up, sliding my fingers over his forearm, feeling the tension coiled beneath his skin. His muscles were tight, his body humming with restraint, like he was still fighting a battle he'd already lost. I tilted my head, my voice barely above a whisper. Are you gonna keep pretending you don't want this? His jaw clenched. His breath came out sharp. You don't get it. Then make me understand. His grip tightened. Something flickered in his eyes, something dangerous, something raw. His fingers tugged just slightly at the robe's tie, loosening it just enough to make my breath hitch, just enough to let the fabric slip, just enough to feel the heat of his body pressing into the space between us. I swallowed hard. This wasn't playful anymore. This wasn't teasing, or testing, or towing the line between what was acceptable and what wasn't. This was a choice. A decision. And I knew, if I didn't walk away now, if I didn't stop this now, there would be no turning back. My fingers tightened in his shirt, gripping the fabric like it was the only thing grounding me. Tell me you don't want this. He exhaled sharply, like he wanted to. Like he was trying. But he didn't say a word. Didn't move away. Didn't let go. The silence was deafening. Then, his hand shifted, trailing up, fingers grazing my ribs, the edge of my waist, his touch barely there, but everywhere all at once. I sucked in a breath, my whole body tensing. I told you, he murmured, his voice rough, barely controlled. You're playing with fire. I let out a breathless laugh, my own hand sliding up his chest, feeling the warmth of his skin through the thin fabric of his shirt. Then burn me. And just like that. The last thread of control snapped. The last thread of control snapped. His hands gripped my waist, pulling me flush against him, the heat of his body pressing into mine like we'd already crossed some invisible line and there was no going back. His breath was warm against my skin, his touch rough, but not hurried, like he was savoring this, savoring me. I exhaled sharply, my fingers curling into his shirt, holding on like I needed something to anchor me. His lips hovered just over my jaw, not quite touching, just breathing me in, making my skin prickle with anticipation. The air between us was thick, electric, charged with something we'd both been holding back for far too long. I felt his fingers tighten, his body tensing against mine. Last chance, he murmured. I swallowed hard. There was no hesitation. No second guessing. Don't stop. And he didn't. His mouth found mine, slow at first, like he was testing me, like he was making sure I wanted this as much as he did. But the moment I kissed him back, the moment my hand slipped beneath the hem of his shirt, dragging my nails lightly over his stomach, something in him snapped. He deepened the kiss, one hand sliding up my back, fingers pressing into my skin, the other gripping my hip, holding me so tightly I could feel his heartbeat pounding against mine. I gasped as he lifted me, setting me onto the counter in one smooth motion, his body pressing between my legs like we belonged there, like we'd always been heading toward this moment. My robe slipped further, the fabric sliding down one shoulder, but I didn't care. His lips trailed lower, skimming my jaw, my throat, his breath hot and uneven, like he was barely holding himself together. I tilted my head back, my own breath shaky. You're not acting very neighborly right now. He let out a breathless chuckle against my skin, his hands gripping my thighs, his fingers digging in. Neither are you. I smiled, my pulse thrumming, my entire body burning under his touch. I should have been thinking about the consequences. About what this would mean in the morning. About the fact that we were neighbors, that this could complicate everything. But I wasn't. All I could think about was him. The way his body felt against mine. The way his breath hitched every time my fingers skimmed over his skin. The way he looked at me, like he wanted to devour me, like he was barely restraining himself, like he'd been waiting for this just as much as I had. I wrapped my legs around him, pulling him closer, feeling the heat of his breath against my ear. Tell me this isn't a mistake, he murmured. I met his gaze, my lips parting slightly, my heart pounding so hard it echoed in my ears. If it is, I whispered, dragging my nails down his back. I don't care. There was no turning back now. His hands tightened on my hips, his breath hot against my skin, every inch of him pressed against me like he was trying to memorize the way we fit together. The slow, careful restraint from before was gone, this was need, raw and unfiltered, something that had been building for far too long. I gasped as his lips found my throat, his fingers slipping beneath the loose fabric of my robe, skimming the bare skin beneath. My body burned under his touch, every nerve alight, every inch of me humming with anticipation. Still don't care, he murmured, his voice low, teasing, full of something dangerous. I exhaled a breathless laugh, my nails dragging lightly down his back. Not even a little. He groaned, his grip tightening, his resolve hanging by a thread. And then? A knock at the door. We both froze. My heart pounded as reality crashed back in, the weight of what we were doing slamming into me all at once. I wasn't sure whether to curse or laugh, but the way he tensed against me told me he was thinking the same thing. The knock came again, more insistent this time. I swallowed hard, still struggling to catch my breath. Expecting someone? He exhaled sharply, dragging a hand through his hair. Not at this hour. I bit my lip, my body still thrumming with everything that had just happened, everything that was about to happen, until we were interrupted. He hesitated, like he was debating whether to ignore it, but the knock came again, louder this time. With a groan, he pulled away, leaving me on the counter, my robe barely hanging on, my skin still burning from his touch. I watched as he ran a hand down his face, his jaw tight, his whole body still tense as he moved toward the door. I adjusted my robe, trying to gather myself, trying to catch my breath, but I could still feel him everywhere. The weight of his hands, the heat of his mouth, the way he had looked at me like he was barely holding himself together. He opened the door. I held my breath. "Hey, man, sorry to bother you," a voice said. Deep. Unfamiliar. "I think I got the wrong apartment." There was a pause. A shift. And then, the guy at the door noticed me. Still sitting on the counter. Still breathless. Still looking every bit like I had just been thoroughly occupied. His eyebrows shot up. Oh. Oh. I wanted the floor to swallow me whole. My neighbor let out a slow breath, his fingers flexing at his sides, his expression unreadable. Then, with the calmest voice I had ever heard, he simply said, "Yeah. Wrong apartment." The guy stammered something, muttered an awkward apology, then disappeared down the hall. The moment the door clicked shut, silence stretched between us. I bit my lip, trying so hard not to laugh. He turned back to me, his jaw tight, his eyes still dark with everything that had just happened, everything that had been about to happen. I arched a brow, teasing. "So, where were we?" His eyes flashed. And before I could say another word, his hands were on me again.